a divorce of the UK from the EU, and on Bottomline East Africa, we certainly continue with that conversation, but bringing it back to the African region and some of the implications that are expected after that particular vote. A panel of three I have. On my extreme left is Felix Okach, who is a multilateral trade expert. Thank you, Felix, for coming in. We also have a social policy analyst in studio, and that is Atieno Ndomo.
Thank
you,
for having
Atieno,
us.
for coming in. Good evening.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm very fine. You're well?
Thanks. Thank you. I'm okay.
And finally, I have an international political and economy professor or lecturer, the USIU, Professor Elijah Munyi. Thank you very much, Prof, for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
And like I said, this is a conversation. The Brexit has been a conversation we've been having since morning, and the kind of reactions we've been having on the social media, that is basically almost everything people have been talking about on the social media today. But one by one, I would really love to know, what was your immediate reaction after you read or saw that UK had voted to leave the EU?
Shocked and disappointed.
At the same time.
Shocked and disappointed. And I think, like most people in the UK, I also didn't think that the Leave campaign would win. So that's the shock. The disappointment, of course, is that if I had been voting, I would have voted to stay. So
I'm coming back to ask for your reasons why you would have loved to be in the Remain camp. But to you, Atieno, what was your immediate reaction?
I think it's surprising because I tried to watch late and then I got tired. So then in the morning, it was kind of, it's determined, it's done. I think everybody thought it would be close, but people thought it would be close and it would perhaps favor the Remain camp. So I think that the surprise, and 4 percentage points isn't that close. So in a sense, and also the other thing that was striking for me is the voter turnout. I think even if you look historically through UK elections, even though referenda are different from general elections, 75% is quite a high voter turnout. So in a sense, the fact that people actually came out means that there were strong feelings either way.
So were you as disappointed as Prof was?
I don't have those kinds of feelings. In a sense, for me, I think that when democracy wins, so in a sense, if this truly reflects what people wanted, then there are useful lessons to do. Like, I am refreshed that in no time the Prime Minister speaks and says, if people have spoken the other way, then the honourable thing to do is to say, I step aside, because
that's literally
the leadership
level of democracy.
Yes,
we don't
so
see
I like that happens. I like that pressure is being now brought to bear on the Labour Party to say, you led the Remain campaign. That hasn't worked. We need to rethink whether you're the right leader for our party. So in terms of those sorts of democratic, signs, that is a good thing. I think any day it means, your democracy is healthy. But as we were speaking before we started, it's also the idea that what's going on with, elections in the world, do people really vote on the basis of objective information? Or can, somebody can wake up and whip up fear, and on the basis of fear and, assertions that perhaps are not, founded in fact, you can actually sway public opinion to a level. So I think we can unpack that further. Look at the US and, people look at Donald Trump's, candidature.
Hold on to that thought. We are definitely coming back to the parameters
and Donald Trump praised
this
them.
particular
Donald Trump praised
them. I have shock and disappointment. She was surprised. What was your reaction?
Imagine I expected to go that direction.
Really?
Yeah. Because last 1 week I've been following the debates. There are three things which are making it come that direction. One, the issue of immigrants in the US, EU. See, now if you're in the member Schengen countries, it means that if you enter one country, you enter in all. So all the refugees who are coming from other parts of the world, once they get into Europe, they have access to Britain. So that the common persons didn't like that. Then two, there's an aspect of EU saying, they say that EU has certain directives on budget reforms which you have to follow. Remember, if Greece did not follow the Greeks didn't follow the reforms, they were in trouble. So Britain was suspecting this might come. Then the last thing is that come 2020, they were supposed to have the euro, the whole area. So there was not going to be the pound. And for a British to tell you that we won't have the pound of the Queen, that's an issue they won't like.
That's something they've wanted to hang on to for a very long time.
And to conclude is that normally when people are voting, it depends on issues in a country at any one time. You remember Kenya, when we had our elections, we were told choices have consequences. And some people thought we were mad when we voted that direction, but we liked it and it's moving on. So that's what
so
that's
whether it is working or not is subject to
another day.
whether it's working for us or not. But You've both mentioned something very important, the issues surrounding a particular election, whether it's a referendum or a normal election. I was reading something online that we have a huge number, if I could say, of people who regret the kind of vote they casted, and most of them voted to leave. And right now, looking at how the reaction has been and how things have gone, they're like, oh, wait a minute. What have we done to ourselves? So do people really understand the issues that surround a particular vote, and not only for the UK, but for the globe as large? Coming into Africa, we have those problems, bigger problems. How do we dissect this? Do we really understand what is needed of us or expected of us?
I think two things. I mean, do the people understand it? That's why I was a little bit curious about the issue of objectivity, and if people don't understand. I think people do understand. I think what really changes is the packaging of campaigns. What's the central issue? The central issue seems to have been migration. But then on leaving the EU, everybody realizes that it's got such massive implications beyond migration, and then everybody's shocked. So I think people didn't quite understand that well, but people were very fed up, or were satisfied, or they were quite determined to not have this idea of massive migrants coming in. So it was packaged as the main issue, or the main issue why the UK had with the EU. But of course, on waking up, you realize that there's so much.
Yes.
Yeah. For us Africans, of course, I would say it's the same. It depends on, for instance, the question I suppose the UK should have asked is there a way we can handle the immigration problem within the EU? So can we renegotiate that part so that we are not part of the common EU migration policy, for instance? And that seems to have been something that the EU was not very open to, and perhaps that's why they decided to go the referendum way.
Do you agree with that? Should the question have been different to help save the situation, if I could call it that?
No, I think there's some things that there's no running away from. I think perhaps what this vote speaks to is whatever internal issues or disgruntlement that exist. So if you unpack the immigration issue, I think what it speaks to, for instance, is internal fears about the status of the economy. People worrying about jobs, people worrying about, because the way the immigration question is cast is one about, everybody's coming in and everybody's taking our jobs, everybody's going to, make our social security system collapse. Like in the UK, they have the National Health Service Scheme, which is kind of free healthcare for everybody. So when you unpack the conversations of ordinary people, it's their fears about their quality of life. So you wish that the way in which the immigration question was framed and the discourse around it was one that actually faces head on what those fears, whether those fears are genuine, whether they're legitimate, and whether there are ways to respond to them. Because why did people get into the European Union? Ideally, you come together because it adds value. So what perhaps this vote says is people are saying, but perhaps we're getting a road deal. But it may also be that the fearmongers had their day. Maybe they spoke so loudly that reason, because I could see even with friends or online, the ones who really were keen on the Remain,
that reason
struggling to make facts and, to even on the immigration question. And you have other people who say, but the UK is a very welcoming country, it's a very multicultural space. Perhaps the people who are very afraid of immigrants without sufficient understanding is a very small number of people. But that's where now, agenda setting comes in. Were they very loud? If you look at the character of the former mayor of London, that kind of a guy. Look at him and look at David Cameron. Cameron just went through an election last year. Now look at, he's having to step aside. And people are potentially talking about, Boris Johnson becoming the, it's incredible. Who would have thought this? Jeremy Corbyn has just fought an election to, get to head the Labour Party. But right now, before he even settles down, the people who are unhappy with him now have an opportunity to actually say, you have failed us. So I think for me, in terms of the issues, and even for our own politics, the last election, for instance, the way in which the ICC question was cast took away from everything else that would have allowed us to assess our leaders. In a sense, you should look at accountability. Are we electing the right people? Are they going to represent our interests? Or have we suddenly been whipped up around an interest that's not even the public interest? So I think for me, those are the interesting dynamics that will be interesting to unpack, because we seem to be in a phase, even in the world. Look at the Philippines, that guy that they elected. This guy who said we can throw out the rule of law, you can shoot people.
And he was still elected.
And he was elected like in a kind of euphoric. So that for me is a worrying trend. And we need to just think about what is happening to our ability to actually choose, our ability for our voice to count, our ability for institutions to represent us.
Well, something else came up, even with the issue of migration and some of the policies that the UK isn't happy with. There's also the issue of some in undertones, of course, that we are unable to make our own decisions. So we are weaker
that's the one,
under the
that's the one,
EU. But if we were alone, we would be stronger. We would
Yes.
be the Great Britain that was
Yes.
there in
Yes.
the former years. Is this the rise of nationalism, Felix?
Not nationalism per se. You see, when you joined the EU, it started way back in 1973. Before that, they had the Treaty of Rome in 1957, which made them come together. And when you talk about economic partnership agreement, is that all European countries had their colonies, African, Caribbean, and Pacific. So they have to make sure that all the colonies are well protected. And they've done that over years, and they started EU in 1973, and it has continued. But over time now, things have changed. A normal British voter, just like a Kenyan voter, sometimes the way we vote, you think we are mad, isn't it? You see the way we vote, isn't it? So they're the same. And in their case, remember, it was so bad, a member of parliament was killed.
Yes,
It's serious. If that had happened in Africa, they would say they would making noise about us. But it's human nature. So people vote on issues which pertain them at that time. Let me give the example of immigrants. They're saying that immigrants who are coming get employed at half the price, the wage.
They're cheaper.
Cheaper, isn't it? So their young people are not getting jobs. So immigrants are getting jobs. So the best thing we don't need is immigrants. And the issue of immigrants is worse. Like in countries like Norway, you see people live in a settlement where the order of life is clean, the environment. For example, in Kenya, if you remember the old Buruburu was a clean place and Umoja, that's how they live in the countries. But when immigrants come in, it's chaotic. In our case, had the Dadaab camp been, say, in Thika or Machakos or in Kisumu or Nakuru, it will be chaos. So that's what they're going through. So when you talk of voting, their issue was the immigrants. They saw that one much more. And the EU, of course, when you join the EU, there are strong regulations about budget reforms. You see Greece is going through that problem. I think Spain went through a similar problem. And of late, EU, Britain is not a major trading partner worldwide. You know, it's not one of the leading as it was. So those are the challenges of that time.
No, but if I was to add, I think it's a very good question. Is it the rise of nationalism? And the answer is I don't think so. But I think it's a very good indictment on the extent of social policy convergence. So if you look at the things that have driven the EU all those years, mostly it's trade. Trade is external. So there was a lot of agreement about what we can do outside the region. But when you get into social policy, you tell people at what age they can retire, you tell people how many refugees they can take. Those are things which we call internal affairs. Now, the EU has encroached on those. And I think, obviously now, it's a lesson for the EU to learn. And the big lesson is there a good balance? Or should we actually pull back on some of the regulations that Brussels has put on social policy, domestic social policy? I think that's what the main message seems to be.
Do you agree with him?
Perhaps,
this is your field. Do you agree with him when it comes to the social policy?
I agree, and I think it's perhaps a question of what space exists within the framework of the European Union to actually have real conversations that recognize countries' specific context and needs. So, for instance, Germany was quite happy to welcome refugees in the first place. If you look at their demographic structure, Germany needs able-bodied people who can work. I mean, the economy can afford it, in a sense, to an extent. So there's a sense to which the level of tolerance for immigrants in Germany would be higher than, say, that of the UK or some other places. So I think in terms of the space that exists within the EU, and I think we can also draw our own lessons when we're pushing on this East African community business. The economic union, and I agree with him, perhaps that's kind of the easiest one, where we're kind of all looking at our own interests and seeing how, as a bloc, we can strike deals that favor us all. But then when you unravel, when you start to talk about the politics, because again, the political federation, that's where people are thinking about the level to which democracy, when people say we're not really represented in the European Parliament, like that's not good enough. Yet they're making such far-reaching decisions that affect us, that, question, national autonomy. So like, why are we having national elections when Brussels makes all the decisions that have such far-reaching implications? We will get there ourselves, because aren't we fast-tracking? In fact, now we've already got monetary union, and I think there's some members of the East African community. I think if you asked Museveni, he will be quite happy for us to get to political, federation.
Yes.
Because he hopes that,
Yes.
maybe
And
he stands
probably
a good
really?
chance.
him sitting at the
Yeah,
helm.
because he's
Really?
always had this, there are people who have ambitions for being the
when we
president
come,
of
if
East
the
Africa.
election was to be held,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Ugandans are less than Tanzania or Kenya. They'll vote him out.
No.
There's
Now
no
you'll be voting
tyranny of
as
numbers
you'll
at
be
play.
voting as East Africans. So we should by that time all be good East African citizens.
Yes.
But see, the thing is, we don't invest, and I think we really model like the East African community along the EU model. You don't invest very much in involving the citizens. So that, for instance, if some of these questions, if there's a mechanism for like involving citizens in, decisions that are being made
Yeah,
in Brussels and
yeah.
that kind of thing. So people don't feel this disconnect. I think the problem was a lot of the disconnect.
All right. I was going to save that for later, but since you brought it up, the EU has been sort of a benchmark for all these blocks that we are trying to have. We have IGAD, we have the East African community that all the countries involved are really trying to put it to its feet, if I could call it that. What's this particular vote by the UK, one of the strongest countries voting to get out of it? What example does this set for the other blocks, like say the East African community? Felix, let's start with you.
You see, East African community, for information, even before independence, we had one currency. We had a similar system, better than what we are coming. We had one currency. Then later on, over time, of course, we split into small regions. But globally, the trade regions are there. There is US one, there's the NAFTA, there's the EU, there's East Africa, EAC, there's SADC commerce. It's all over. So it's not that it's something special, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But let me attack one aspect you mentioned about nationalism in Britain. The British, they are unlike us, that it's a royal lifestyle. Kingdom is the kingdom. It's not the premise. The prime minister, if you're elected, you go to the Queen to report that actually been elected. So it's you have to look at that aspect of culture as well. It's not like American system where things are free. And to follow up the British issue also, I remember when President Obama, he was in US. In Britain. And of course, during the visit, he mentioned that they brought him the play of Othello to see the black man, and he advised them, please stay in Europe as like EU as the others. But there's one of them who abused Obama. He said, look, this is son of one of Kenyan what? Kenya was our colony, son of somebody who was in our colony. So they're trying to show that this is, after all, there's nothing you can tell us, you belong to our colony.
Prof,
so it just shows,
Prof, do you think this would hurt the idea of regionalism, especially, let's just bring it back home to the East African community?
I wouldn't say hurt, but I think it's a very good lesson. And I think it affects us a lot in two ways. One, East African community is a community which has been very much modeled on the lines of the EU in the sense of an ever closer union. So the idea of a political federation, without even thinking if we need it, really, or if it has to be there. Now, we do have other examples. ASEAN, for instance, there's a lot of integration in the Southeast Asian countries. But there's a lot of economic integration without necessarily involving issues of policy when people retire, how much refugees you can take. So they're very clear about the way they're approaching it. Now, it's good in the sense that we should take a lesson and really question whether we need things like monetary union if you have perfect convertibility of the shilling, Ugandan shilling, Kenyan shilling, and so on. So one, it's just a wake-up call for us to think of if we need to continue with the idea of integration for integration's sake. Secondly, it brings in, it cautions us. If we want the East African community to go on, you have to think if to make it a democratic process. I think up to now, the idea of the East African community has been a very political process at the presidential level or at the bureaucratic level. Now, slowly by slowly, people are starting to feel that actually EAC rules on sugar affect us. EAC rules on rules of origin or clothing affect us. Now, when a farmer in Mumias learns that actually there is nothing your government can do about protecting your sugar industry, because we are an open economy and we operate on the basis of competition, then politics comes in and democratic deficit comes in. So in a sense, we can't continue having the East African regional integration process as a bureaucratic process up there without involving people.
Atenu, yes.
I think
You
it's
should
a
say something.
verdict and it's a lesson to draw on.
Yeah.
Do we really exercise our minds to ideas that we import and implement? So perfect example, we model along the lines of the EU. Never mind that, as he's saying, historically we had a history of association.
Yeah.
So, the people who contrast a top-down East African community and integration process versus if we did a bottom-up. Bottom-up would be about integrating our cultures. It would be about what brings us together. When people describe the culture and the arts, for instance, tell you there's a lot of similarities between young people who are musicians, people who are singing in Tanzania. We listen to Tanzanian music artists, from Uganda. Ugandans listen to artists from Kenya and all, and they like it. So if you wanted to, craft a perfect integration of cultures, of communities, of ideals, of ideas, you can do it. So it means, we don't have to just be lazy and to say, because it used to be the template, I think, up till today. And I think now the EU is going to unravel, which is just as well, because then we don't have like that perfect example that we are all aspiring to. So it means we can go back and actually exercise our minds to what kind of a union would work. And some people would dare say it goes beyond the kind of Eastern Africa region. We really should be thinking at the level of Africa. Because if you do a formidable economic bloc, when we negotiate with the rest of the world, that can bring a lot of returns and dividends for us if we present ourselves as a market. But that doesn't take away the fact that there's a lot of homework to be done. Because when I'm thinking about like merging us as a people, the idea of cultural differences, we have to like rise above that. We have to have a politics that's very progressive, not the kind of politics which we do now, which is, the politics is not about public interest. Politics is about, self, individual interest, and then we have such differences because the way Tanzanians, the kind of values that they uphold may be very different from the values that Kenyans uphold.
Or
so
Ugandans,
you need leaders that allow us to kind of find the best in terms of the values that we have and invest in. So coming together, converging around the things that strengthen us, that bring us together, as opposed to things that, perhaps don't uplift us.
You can also see, like in the South African scenario, it's a bit different from the EU one. Because EU are the British, the German, the French, those speak different languages and different historical
diverse.
Quite diverse. If you come to East Africa, we are not as diverse as they are. First of all, the Swahili being spoken across.
Except Uganda.
Except
some
Uganda.
Ugandans actually, but not most of them.
Mostly policemen and
in Uganda they say Swahili is a language for prisoners and
cops.
and cops, whatever it is. So, okay, there's the Swahili language, and then there's the English, of course, English across schools. And then we share common, our borders are not as strict as those, they are rather porous. And these borders we have, they were put by the Europeans. They are people living across can walk easily. For example, take my people in Bigori, the Luos, they are in Sebania and across in Tanzania. They are even elected in Tanzania. Come to Arusha, the Maasais are this side and the other side. And Busia also, the vice president, are worried that. So ours is a bit different from that.
All right. Yeah. And after most of the conversation we've seen after this particular vote, I would see so many people ask what happens to the trade relations between Kenya and the UK and other countries that have trade relations with these particular countries. Going forward, what are we looking at? What kind of scenario are we looking at?
The trade now will be bilateral. We negotiate with Britain individually. Visa issues individually, and EU individually. Those are the changes coming in.
Do we expect it to hurt some of the probably exports like Kenya? We export a lot of flowers.
How do you say prof on that one?
Let's prof.
The
expert.
We are going to have a very intense period over the next 2 years. It is a big effect on trade. One is that the current trading regime that we use as East African countries was negotiated under the EU. It's called Economic Partnership Agreements. Now, it means that those agreements have to be renegotiated. So that will have to now become the bilateral agreement with the UK. But how, or the final outcome that those renegotiated outcomes take will very much depend on the kind of renegotiation that the UK will have with the EU. In other words, if the UK is going to be part of the single market, single EU market, we may not have to change the EPAs so much. But of course there's talk now because the UK exit is not so good. other European countries, other EU countries are considering that one way to punish the UK and to dissuade other people from getting out of the UK is actually to deny the UK the single market, which will be not a favorable position for us.
So has this plunged us into
So
a
these
trade limbo?
These has strengthened us into a trade limbo, but we will know exactly depending on the kind of renegotiation that the UK will have with the rest of the EU. Hopefully, we hope that they are allowed to remain part of the single market, meaning that our goods traveling to our flowers or French beans going to London can be allowed to cross. It's considered open for them to cross to any other European country.
Quickly, something else interesting happened today. The sterling pound, you
gone down, which means
immediately
that
after
imports
the
from
vote.
Britain are cheaper for us.
Yes. What does this mean for us?
This is very tricky because actually in the short run, as in today and the following week, if the pound falls, for a moment it's good for us because if we are paying debts using the pound or the shilling, the conversion rate gets better for us. So actually, monetary policy of currency, depending on what our priorities are, for instance, if it's debt repayment, a cheaper pound is good for us. A cheaper pound, on the other hand, is not so good for us because actually it means the shilling is stronger and our exports become more expensive for the UK. So that is something else that would affect our trade. And already we are having a trade deficit. The UK is actually exporting more. So ideally, we should have a cheaper shilling. But if our priority is to either repay debts or actually because now the UK imports are cheaper and we are importing quite a bit from there. So it's positive. So in the short run, there are a lot of things that need to be balanced. Currency policy, and trade policy.
All right. I'm being told that we do not have too much time on our hands, but I'll give you each 30 seconds to just, as we wind up, looking at what happened in the UK with the EU, going forward with the lessons that we carry forward, what do we expect to see in the East African region going forward? I'll start with you, Felix.
Going forward, there's not much change because our major exports of flowers go through Netherlands. Britain is not a major trading partner. But the British investments here will suffer because now they won't get as much what they used to get. And then international, now the trade worldwide, global, we trade with in dollar and euro, not much of.
So what do we do to cushion such scenarios?
We are trading in the dollar, which is not British pound. We're trading in euro majorly. So British pound is not the main currency. But all I know is advantageous to us because the rate will go down.
All right. Atieno, going forward?
I think Kenya and the UK have maintained bilateral relations that are very strong. I think even if you assess in terms of trade agreements that are bilateral between Kenya and the UK, there's quite a substantial amount of that. So in terms of those, you probably expect that to stay a constant. If I was the East African community leadership, the instructive lessons is the point I was making earlier, is we really should stop being intellectually lazy and we should think.
What a way to put it.
Yes, it really is. When we just borrow things, templates, and we think they're good to go and we can just cut and paste and, we're good to go. I think we have an opportunity to craft an East African integration or even, I dare say, at the level of Africa-wide integration that responds to the interests and the needs of Africans. All
right. Prof, I'll let you have the last word on this.
Very simple. I would expect a very strong delegation convened by the AU, African Union, go to Brussels to make sure that when the UK is renegotiating its exit, it's given single market access to the EU.
All right.
That will take care of African markets.
All right. Thank you very much for coming in. Quite an interesting conversation. I would love that we would have had much time, but thank you very much. I have Professor Elijah Munyi, who is a lecturer at the United States International University. Thank you very much for coming in. And Atieno Ndomo, who is a social policy expert. And finally, we have Felix Okach, who is a multilateral trade expert. Thank you very much for coming in. And as we wind up, let's take a look at some of the stories that made it to the headlines in the week and some of the things that we should expect in the coming week in the East African region. Just about to take a look at them on this Super Bowl. Just see what made headlines in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and the other East African countries. The week that was, Kenya and Ethiopia signed pipeline deals. If you can remember, Kenya lost out when it came to the Uganda pipeline deal, but it looks like there is a light at the end of the tunnel as Ethiopia has come in. Pacts have been signed, and we definitely expect that this would go a long way and not only ensuring the strengthening ties between these two countries, but of course the economies of both. Uganda to withdraw troops from AMISOM. About 6,000 troops or soldiers from Uganda who have been contributed to AMISOM are set to be withdrawn. Uganda has posted some of the concerns there, and this is some of the big stories that we are posting here from this week. President Uhuru Kenyatta signed the anti-doping bill into law, quite an evasive bill here that risked having Kenya not participate in the Rio Olympic, but it looks like where all systems go. We have former DRC Vice President Jean-Pierre Bemba jailed for 18 years, and this of course was at the International Criminal Court. And finally, next week, some of the things we should expect. Besigye, Kizza Besigye treason charge hearings. This is in Uganda, and we'll definitely be keeping you posted on this, as we will have our ears and eyes on the ground on what really is happening. Final preparations for the AU summit in Rwanda that will take place between the 10th and the 18th of July. And finally, IEBC Joint Select Committee in the country. There is dialogue with regards to the electoral body. I will definitely be taking a look at whether this Joint Select Committee will come in place and start negotiations on how to conduct elections come 2017. Many thanks for joining us on Bottomline East Africa. Betty Kialo is gearing up to bring you Friday briefing. Next, my name is Akisa Wandera. Enjoy the rest of your evening. A lovely weekend ahead, and keep it KTN News.